Welcome back to Ethics. I'm Tom, an instructor, and today we are going to talk about the first half of Book 1 of Plato's Republic. So Plato's Republic is one of Plato's most famous texts, and it's an entire book. When they say Book 1, Book 2, they really mean they're more like chapters. So it's an entire book-length piece, and we're only going to be talking about the first kind of chapter in that, which is Book 1, and it's split up into two modules and two lecture videos here. So Plato is a famous ancient Greek philosopher. He is writing about 400 BC, and Plato was actually a student of Socrates. Socrates himself never wrote anything, but what is significant about this is that Plato uses the character of Socrates as his main protagonist. So whatever Socrates is saying is usually what Plato is thinking, and the views that Plato wants to advance. So sometimes when I say Socrates or Plato, in the context of the Republic, I really mean the same person, right? One thing with dialogues such as the Republic to keep in mind is that they can be really hard to follow, and sometimes they talk about things in very strange ways, talking about horse trainers and all kinds of stuff. But the thing to really follow is what's called a Socratic definition, right? The Republic is about the question, what is justice? That's what the whole text is trying to answer, that question. And when they ask the question, what is justice, what they're looking for is it was called Socratic definition, right? And this kind of definition is supposed to give us an answer as to what is, the essence of justice, right? And what allows us to differentiate between some act or person or institution that is just from something that's unjust, right? And so based on that, the definition we're looking for is not just a description of justice. It's not just examples of justice or something like this. If you said justice is what happens in a courtroom or something like this, that would not be sufficient, right? Lots of things happen in the courtroom, and sometimes we think those things are just or examples, manifestations of genuine justice, and sometimes they're not. And so when we're looking for a Socratic definition, it has to do with how, our concept of justice it serves as a criterion by which we're able to differentiate, justice from not something that's unjust, right? And so in the dialogues, what really happens is, some interlocutor that Socrates is speaking with proposes some definition of what justice is, and usually Socrates will, reveal some kind of inconsistency or shortcoming of that definition, and then it is altered or scrapped altogether and replaced by a new one or something like this. So the way to track this kind of Socratic dialogue, right, or Platonic dialogue, is to track these definitions, right? And so that's what we're going to do today. They're talking about what justice is. And the first definition that crops up here is that justice is to give back what one has taken from one another, right? So the proposal here is, justice is when you give back to people what someone has taken from them, right? And at first glance, this seems pretty decent, right? If someone steals something, you should give that thing back, and that's justice, right? But we might think right off the bat, it's a little too narrow. But that's not really the take that Socrates takes. What he actually says is he gives what's called a counterexample, right? So a situation in which that meets this definition but we don't think is really justice, right? And the scenario that he gives is this scenario in which a friend gives you weapons to hold on to for them, right? And then they come back to you in a fit of madness, right? And then, according to this definition, the just thing to do is to give the weapons back, right? So, a contemporary example of this would be, your friend knows that he or she is suffering from mental illness and bouts of depression and stuff like this, maybe suicidal thoughts or whatever, and they own a gun and they ask you to hold on to it for them, right? And then all of a sudden they come knocking on your door at 3 o'clock in the morning and they're sweaty and they're going all crazy and they're like, I need my gun back right now, right? According to this definition, the right thing to do would be to give back what is theirs, right? And so this looks like maybe it's not enough of a definition, right? It's too broad here. It's allowing things that are not just to fall underneath the definition. So they alter this definition here. And the second definition we get is that justice is restoring to each person what is due to them, right? And this idea of what is due to someone is supposed to kind of get rid of those examples, right? And the idea would be in that previous example that your friend, that weapon is not due to them in some sense, right? They don't deserve that at that time, right? They're not in a proper place to have that weapon back. And so the second definition, that justice is restoring to people what is due to them, is supposed to kind of narrow down the definition. But what Socrates kind of comes back and says is that this is too narrow, right? There's much more to justice than just giving people back what has been taken from them. And for example, things like obeying the law or helping another person, or just I don't know, not doing something bad, right, is supposed to be an example of justice. When everyone obeys the law and it acts peacefully, no one's really giving anything back to anyone. We're not really talking about exchange of property, but that is an instance of justice, right? So it seems like we need to change our definition a little bit. And so the third definition is supposed to expand on this now a little bit. And the third definition is that justice is doing good to friends and doing harm to enemies. Now, this looks like it's maybe promising, and there is what Socrates points out is that we need a further kind of qualification here. And this qualification is that justice is doing good to who is in fact one's friend and doing harm to who is in fact one's enemy, right? Because if you think justice is doing good to friends and harm to enemies, but you're mistaken about who your real enemy is and who your real friend is, then you're not going to be really successful with this definition. You'll be doing good to your enemies and harm to your friends, right? And so he makes this qualification here. But notice at this point, the idea of basically, the notion is that you're punishing evildoers and rewarding, people who are doing good, right? And this actually looks pretty intuitive now, as an overarching proposition of what justice is, right? And lots of our aspects of our legal system look like this, right? When someone does something wrong, we put them in jail or we give them a fine or whatever, we do harm to them, right? And if someone's doing good, then, we either, oftentimes it's just, they don't have those kinds of punishment. But in some case, like, someone is wronged and they did nothing wrong, maybe in a civil suit, they would get money or something like this. Someone's wrongfully jailed, they might get restitution back, something like this, right? So this looks much more like kind of our contemporary notion of justice. But at this point, then Socrates kind of brings out the big guns, as it were, and levels a pretty strong and sophisticated argument, right? What Socrates says is he says, look, okay, you say justice is doing good to who's your friend and doing bad to who's your enemy. Um, but, think about doing harm to something, right? And he says, if you do harm to like a horse, right? Does that horse become a better horse or does it become worse, right? And Socrates' interlocutor says, well, it becomes worse, right? And you could say the same thing about most living things, right? Like, if you do harm to a dog, if the dog is traumatized or abused, right, it becomes a worse dog. It's what Socrates would say was corrupted, right? It has problems, interacting with other dogs and people and things, right? Um, and you could say the same thing about, a child or what have you. Um, and so he deduces from these kinds of examples that harming something doesn't improve it or make it better; it makes it worse, right? And then he also proposes that what a just person is supposed to do is to make others better, right? So a just person should make the world a better place, right? Not a worse place. A just person should be, making others more just, right? Spreading justice around in some sense. And he says, and if this is the case, then by this definition, you have a just person, doing unjust acts by harming others, right? And and so he thinks that on this definition, a just person fails to live up to what a just person is supposed to do. And then he infers from this that it is in no instance just to harm anyone or injure someone. Um, Now, this is a very strong claim, right? That it's never right to harm another individual. There's a lot packed into this idea. One thing to ask is, what does it mean to harm someone? So, for example, what a surgeon does can be thought to harm someone, right? They cut them open. But um, the idea is that that's not really harm. Really, what the surgeon is doing, kind of long term, the long game there is that they're healing the person, right? That there's a certain amount of harm that has to be done in order to heal, right? Or something like working out, going to the gym, right? It makes your muscles hurt, but the idea is that it makes them actually stronger in the long run, right? And also, you can think about this in terms of like punishment, at least and like with a small child, right? Sometimes they really hate when you tell them that they can't have a cookie or they have to go to bed or whatever. But the idea is that you're not hurting that kid, you are helping them, right? You're doing the things that need to be done in order for them to be healthy, right? So there's a lot packed into the idea of what it really means to harm someone. Um, and so that can be really discussed quite a bit. But nonetheless, I mean, I think there is a strong sentiment against this, that there are times where the right thing to do is to hurt someone when they deserve it, right? Punish someone, that sometimes people do bad things, and the just thing to do is to make that person pay for it, right? What's oftentimes referred to as retributivist justice, right? Um, so anyways, this is a strong claim, and Socrates is very much on the side of thinking that human beings are essentially good, and that we need to kind of foster that goodness rather than try to take it away by corrupting that, in terms of, and for him it's harming others would corrupt that goodness. So that's where we're going to leave it for now, and that's the first kind of section of book one here. Okay, talk soon.